it's a tyrannical way of doing politics where we say, well, you can't say this and you can't joke about this. And we've got these sacred cows that cannot even be tackled through comedy. That to me was a bad sign. It was a sign that we were moving in the wrong direction, and it worried me.
Hello and welcome to this week's Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. My guest today is Konstantin Kisin, the comedian and author of An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Konstantin has written an enjoyable polemic arguing for free speech, particularly in comedy, and it's this that is very close to my heart. You may have noticed it's a little off-piece from history, but Konstantin is an engaging guest, so I'm sure you can forgive me. Now, growing up with stand-up comics such as Richard Pryor, Alexei Sayle, Eddie Murphy, Jerry Sadowitz, Stuart Lee, Norm Macdonald, Doug Stanhope, and the great Bill Hicks. These are all comedians that have pushed boundaries and offended. But how would some of them get on now? As we've seen recently, even police forces are getting involved with comedy. We then chat about his background, with several generations of his family having suffered terribly at the hands of the Soviet system. Konstantin's experience of that system has led him to be very aware of where we are as a society today, and his book looks at life under totalitarian regimes, and are we living in a time when we too have to be careful about what we say. Now, I'm not an absolutist on free speech. We have hate speech laws for extremism, but there are countless examples of individuals who've lost their jobs and reputations recently, and the same things happened in the Soviet Union. All links are in the show notes, and you can listen to Konstantin's podcast, Trigonometry, which features interviews with historians, including our own Roger Morehouse. I've put in links with two great examples in there. Head over to our website for more great historical content. If you want to get hold of me, you can via the Twitter, and our email address is history@aspectsofhistory.com. I hope you'll enjoy our chat. Konstantin Kisin, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're here to talk about your new book that I think has only just been out less than a week, which is An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, which I've just finished and I enjoyed very much. And really, I thought we'd start off just introducing you to my listeners because I guess you've had quite a meteoric rise, actually. I was thinking about this after a bit of controversy, but you're actually a comedian. But before I sort of introduce you, I wondered if you could do it because you've got a very interesting rise in your career.
It's funny you should say that. One of my favorite quotes is from an American baseball player called Yogi Berra, who was known for having witticisms of certain and that told a lot of truth, but they were concealed in a wrapper of humor. And he said that it took me 10 years to be an overnight success. And I kind of feel like that as well. Like I have been working very hard, but there have been events that have helped to speed my career along. So very briefly about me, I was born in the Soviet Union in 1982. I lived in different parts of it, in the Russian part of it, in the Ukrainian part of it. I lived in Uzbekistan for a period of time as well, where my dad was from. He was born there, not Uzbek himself, but that's where he was born. For reasons that history fans will probably appreciate, Stalin moved a lot of tribes and peoples around the country to keep them pacified. So my Greek family ended up living in the deserts, essentially in the arid wastes of Uzbekistan, as a result of those movements of people. I lived in the Soviet Union until it collapsed, and then I lived in Russia for a few years before my parents managed to scrape enough money to send me to boarding school in the UK, which I was very grateful for. I had a very good education at school. I went to university, and at this point, my dad, who by this moment, I don't talk about this in the book, but it might be interesting, he'd become a junior minister in Boris Yeltsin's government. He was subject to some false allegations. Long story short, he had to flee Russia under false identity. And it meant that my family went from being quite wealthy to not having any money at all, going back to our humble beginnings. In the space of about 5 years, this happened. We were very poor, then my dad became a millionaire, then we were very poor again. And it meant I never got to finish my degree at Edinburgh University, which I was studying economics and politics. And I sort of looked around and went, well, what skills do I have? And I spoke Russian, I spoke English, and I understood a bit of politics and culture and business and economics. So I started my own translation business. And I did that for about 10 years. And then eventually I got really bored of it. I had like an early midlife crisis in my early 30s, I think. And I thought, I'm not doing enough creative stuff. What can I do that would give an outlet to my creative interests? And that's when I got into comedy. And I did that for a few years. I was, doing very well, traveling around the country, performing in different clubs. And that was the case really up until about, I would say, late 2017, early 2018, at which point I started noticing that in the comedy industry, something very odd was happening. And I think it was tied into Brexit and Trump and all of the political events that were happening. But there was a sort of feeling that suddenly it was now, instead of comedians being what I thought comedians were supposed to be, which is pushing back against the mainstream dogmas of the day, challenging orthodoxy, questioning things, saying the unsayable, making jokes that some people would find offensive, but that was kind of the point. To suddenly the words were violence and we're all oppressing each other with jokes and all of this started happening. And then I think also around Brexit, it was quite an odd experience for me because, people can't see me, but I'm a dark-skinned first-generation immigrant. And there was this narrative that suddenly half the country were racist bigots because they'd voted for Brexit. Now I voted Remain in the referendum, but it didn't match my experience of living in this country for over 20 years. My experience of Britain is that it's one of the most welcoming, tolerant places in the world. And I've traveled quite extensively around the world. So I sort of feel I have something to compare against. And that was very odd to me. Suddenly I would be standing backstage about to go on at a comedy club and I'd hear some, white kid in his 20s go on and talk about, well, I'm a straight white man, therefore I'm evil, and then have some kind of joke about that. And that didn't really make any sense to me. I didn't understand why the comedy industry thought that, all Brexit voters are racist and all of this stuff. And so my friend, another comedian, and I, Francis Foster, we started a podcast and a YouTube show called Trigonometry, really to try and understand what was going on. Why were these things happening? Why was comedy now oppressive and whatever else people were saying it was? Why were people clearly lying about the reason that certain political movements were happening? And in doing so, we started to explore some of these themes. We had a lot of left-wing Brexiteers on, for example, on the show to try and okay, look, yeah, the Tories are all evil. We know that, right? But what is you voted for Brexit and you're left wing. Why did you do that? So it was really a show that came out of ignorance and curiosity, a potent mix. We were we don't know what's going on, but we'd quite like to, and we'd like to do that with an open mind. And through doing that, we met a lot of different people, explored a lot of different political perspectives, and it kind of filled a niche that I was always interested in, which was understanding politics, understanding political philosophy, and history obviously is a huge part of that process as well. And then my own comedy career continued, and one of the things that happened that many people know about is in the very end of 2018, I was offered to do a gig at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and when they invited me to perform, this was to raise money for charity. They sent me a behavioral agreement form, which said that if I agreed to perform, I have to sign this contract, which said that they have a zero tolerance policy on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, anti-atheism, and it also said that all jokes must be respectful and kind. And when I turned it down, it became quite a big story. And that was really an illuminating moment for me, because up until that point, because of the way the comedy industry is, it's very progressive. It's always been sorry.
Had you started Trigonometry before?
Just. We'd started
right.
Trigonometry in April 2018, and this happened in late November, early December 2018.
Okay.
So it was a few months into it. And of course, our experience as two comedians who were having conversations with these quote unquote problematic people on our show was we were essentially in the process of getting pushed out of the comedy industry anyway, because we were having the wrong conversations with the wrong people. And the comedy industry's view of us was that we were these evil, right wing, whatever people who, we were starting to see that people would start booking us for comedy gigs. We were starting to see that the opinion of us sort of in the zeitgeist of the comedy industry was that we were wrong, bad, and evil. And because of that, it was quite tempting for us, I suppose, to assume that lots of people out there in the real world felt that way as well. And to use a modern term, we were quite gaslit by the environment we were operating in. So when this contract thing happened and I turned it down, and just for context, you've got to understand, at this point, I was a comedian with absolutely no profile, turning down an unpaid charity gig from a university that no one cares about. And this happened the day that it was the second biggest story on the BBC News website, was the day that Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, was nearly removed from office by her own party. We didn't know at the time this would happen every 6 months with the Tory party, though they decided to remove the leader. So it seemed quite odd at the time, and it was a big deal. And what I think that told me really is it was clear to me, I have an ego, but not an ego of the size that I thought this story really was about me. What I noticed was that so many people reached out to me with stories of their own where they said, well, look, you refused to sign this contract, but actually I live my life on a daily basis as if I've signed this contract because I fear for my job. I fear what people will say and do to me and my family if I say what I think in public. And so that's when I really understood that the conversation we were having about free speech and comedy, which we thought was really limited to us, to our creative industry, which is always going to be slightly out there, actually was reflective of a broader set of movements in society where, and I talk about this in the book, where now 50% of people feel more afraid to say what they think than they did a few years ago in this country. And in America, 2/3 of people are afraid to express their political opinions in public, including a majority of even Democrats.
I guess we always think we're politically reasonable. Everyone thinks that, don't they? But I definitely recognise that. Certainly from a previous career as well. Even when I wasn't doing a podcast or anything, I would be careful within a corporate environment as to what I would say, and that's certainly the case. Doing this, I'm very careful. I don't want to offend people, but
I do. So that's
I'm
fine.
certainly not a comedian though, but part of the comedian's job is to offend. I've always thought, because I grew up in the sort of late 80s, 90s. We had all those comedians who were being very offensive to there was no one safe. I'm thinking Bill Hicks and Alexi Sale and those sorts of people.
Yeah, and George Carlin and people like that. And I'm glad you gave those examples rather than later iterations, which are the Jimmy Carr and the Frankie Boyles, who are perfectly entitled to do the jokes that they do. But what was always important to me with people like Bill Hicks and George Carlin is they were not just going out and trying to make fun of some minority group for being a dwarf or for being disabled or whatever, which was more the Frankie Boyle direction, frankly. The people that I was thinking about were people who were actually challenging some of the political dogmas of the day. And to me, that was always the role of certainly a satirist or a comedian who had political inclinations, which I always did. And I thought it was a really important sign of a healthy society because, as you know, having read the book, in Russia, in my lifetime, I watched this happen where we went from the Soviet Union where no comedy criticizing politicians was allowed. Then Boris Yeltsin comes in, there's an opening up. And people make an equivalent of spitting image, which was incredibly popular. Because imagine this, we've lived for 70 years in a society where if you criticize the leaders, you're going to go to the camps, you're going to get executed, your work will never be published, etc. To suddenly you've got these great talented satirists who are making fun of the events, which are extraordinary by any standard anyway, and you've got this comedic narration of everything that's happening in your society. It was exciting. I remember being a little kid and the whole family sitting down to watch Spitting Image, and it was so the equivalent of Spitting Image in Russia, and it was so well made that even like a 10-year-old like me could enjoy it because the jokes were so brilliant. And of course, the moment Vladimir Putin comes in 1999, his first act is to end any satire and any comedy that targets him or any of the senior political leaders in the country in any way. So I saw what happens in unfree societies, and the fact that essentially what I see is the suppression of comedy and the suppression of satire, and the fact that there's things that you can't joke about. To me, that is a sign of tyranny. I'm not saying we live in a tyrannical society where there's a tyrant in charge, but it's a tyrannical way of doing politics where we say, well, you can't say this and you can't joke about this. And we've got these sacred cows that cannot even be tackled through comedy. That to me was a bad sign. It was a sign that we were moving in the wrong direction, and it worried me a lot.
Do you think there are comedians today that are there any comedians? I mean, I know Jimmy Carr is recently got into a bit of hot water. But I'm not sure if he's really the kind of comedian that is pushing boundaries that I mean, he's funny, but he's not pushing boundaries that I think comedians that I remember from my youth are.
No, I agree with you. I think Jimmy is a very good joke writer, but he's pushing different kinds of boundaries, not ones I was ever particularly interested in pushing myself. But he should have every right to do that if he wants to. And he's obviously had his very successful career. What I would say is, particularly when we get into all this conversation, well, you know, comedians say you can't say anything these days, but here they are selling out a Netflix special or whatever. Like, my argument was never that Dave Chappelle, for example, who I genuinely think is doing something valuable on that front, can't say what he wants or can't make the jokes that he wants. But that, you remember where I was coming from. I was a comedian on the comedy circuit, right? That basically means no one knows who you are. You are hired by comedy clubs to come and do a 10, 15, 20-minute set on a Saturday night. And your job is to travel around the country and entertain people. And you are being paid and booked by individual people within the comedy industry who are deciding whether you're suitable for their comedy night. So that your future is not in your hands, and you have absolutely no power. You are not someone like Dave Chappelle who can say, well, look, if Netflix cancels me, I'll go and put up my special on my own website, and it's still going to probably get more views than it otherwise would have done. But if you're just a circuit comic, which is what most comedians are, you're incredibly vulnerable to the opinions of other people in the comedy industry. And I know friends, for example, who, they've lost work as a result of not even expressing an opinion politically, but like, for example, saying that they're friends with me or defending something I've said or whatever. So you've got this situation where a tiny industry in the UK, which is the comedy industry, everyone's watching everyone, and no one's supposed to say the wrong thing, and no one's supposed to step out of line. And that was the environment that I was talking about. Yes, super successful comics who've already made it, they can do whatever the hell they want, but we're stifling the next generation of people coming through, and have been for quite some time.
Yeah, the loss of a sense of humor in the society is a very, very bad sign. I mean, you mentioned in the book, a comedian who made a joke about Brexit. I think was it Alistair Williams?
Alistair Williams, yeah.
I mean, I was quite a passionate Remainer myself, but I found that joke quite funny. I didn't understand why you can't laugh. Why can't we laugh at our own, beliefs and things? But we're becoming less good at laughing at ourselves as well.
Well, we take everything more seriously now, don't we? The passions are running very high and wild in society. So everything is very serious, and people now deliberately misinterpret jokes. This is the other thing about the comedy environment that we're operating in. Comedy very often relies on goodwill. This is why one of the most important qualities for a comedian is actually not being funny, it's being likable. You're not, imagine you're at a party and there's a guy that you really don't like. It doesn't really matter how funny his jokes are. If you don't like him, you're not going to laugh at his jokes or her jokes. So it's kind of the same with comedy. Comedy relies on goodwill. It relies on the assumption that you're probably not saying the things that you're saying from a bad place. You're not trying to hurt anyone. You're just doing jokes. But if everything is interpreted through the prism of politics, then, well, are you joking, or are you making a political point? Are you from the other team? Do I have to now take everything you say literally? Because of course, irony is such a huge part of comedy as well. It's saying something you do not mean, and relying on your audience to appreciate that you don't mean it. Or, as you say, in case of Alistair, he just made some very good observations about the way that Brexit was being handled. It didn't have to be a Remainer or a Brexiteer to find it funny. It was just very good observational comedy. But if you are the sort of Remainer, unlike us, who thinks that Remain is the end of the world, leave is the end of the world, and it's not it's like a death in the family. It's not to be joked about. Then of course it doesn't matter how good the jokes are or how good the comedian is. You're gonna find it offensive. And Alistair paid a heavy price for doing that routine.
Well, I was very offended because I have a double-barrel name and I've got a posh accent, and you did have a go at a double-barrel posh accented people.
Well,
yeah, but you're forgiven. You're forgiven.
Thank you. It's very kind.
The other thing that you mentioned was that you have John Cleese was rather a fan of yours, and then I was noticing, because you mentioned you went to Clifton College. I think John Cleese went there as well, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
Also, one of my favourite classicists went there. Have you ever heard of G.E.M. de Saint Croix?
No, I haven't. he sounds like a middle class guy with an almost double-barreled name as well.
Very much so. He was a brilliant classicist. He was also very left wing. He wrote a book about the class struggle in the ancient world. But yeah, worth
middle class
out.
People often do.
Yes, indeed. Double-barreled posh people. But John Cleese as well. But also, I wanted to ask you
Oliver,
about.
by the way, just for the record, I should say I have nothing against people with double-barrel surnames or who are posh. There's nothing wrong.
Don't worry, you can be.
But this is actually an important point. My issue with that I raise in the book is not so much about that. Is that I think some of the modern ideologies that I have an issue with are people from that background who are pushing things that actually. The term is luxury beliefs now, that they are expressing opinions which make them feel good, but actually hurt a lot of normal working class, ordinary people. That's my concern. So just to be clear on that.
No, absolutely. Thank you.
And you got the
problem. Now, I wanted to ask you about a recent development, actually, because just sticking with the comedy a bit longer, because Joe Lycett who's a comedian who has actually been, I think, contacted by the police after he did a set, I think, and a member of the audience reported him to the police. And this is just, I'm hoping things will improve, but it doesn't look like they are, if this kind of thing is happening.
Yeah, and the reality is once you make being offensive a crime, then this will happen. And we have laws on the books now that make being offensive a crime. We've had, the last time I checked, it was figures for 2017, I think. I talked about this in my Edinburgh show. Over 3,000 people a year get arrested in this country for things that they say on social media. And a lot of it is to do with being offensive. I don't know if you're familiar with the case of Harry Miller. He's a former police officer who tweeted some kind of supposedly transphobic limerick or something, or offensive limerick about trans people. And he had the police call him up and tell him that they need to check his thinking. And the same thing with Joe Lycett. He got a call from the police getting him to explain his jokes. It seems to me that is not a healthy direction for society to be moving in, but that is unfortunately the legislative environment in which we're now operating, which is why I think it's really important that we see pushback against that. But you're right, actually, it's been moving in the wrong direction, even under the supposedly libertarian and free-thinking Boris Johnson government. That's what we were told he was. But actually, he was pushing through this online harms bill, which would criminalize and restrict comedy even further. So we will see who emerges from the latest story, Bloodbath, and maybe that person is going to be more in favor of allowing people to make jokes without being criminals.
Yeah, it's a very worrying move. So I wanted to move on a little bit about your, because you've mentioned that in your just talking about your background, your career, but your family, your family history, which it's sort of tied up with the latter half of the 20th century and Russia, and it's so interesting in the book, reading about it, because I don't think we get to see the sort of human side of these policies in Soviet Russia, and then particularly I think you go way back to your great grandfather. I think you mentioned was interred in a gulag, and I wanted to just hear a little bit about that.
Well, I actually like to start with his daughter, my grandmother, and she was born. Eleanor. She was born in a gulag. Because her father and her mother had been interned there. Her father was there because he was a Polish communist who came over to join the great communist cause. And once they'd realized that they don't want Polish people or Polish communists or foreign communists or whatever, they went through iterations of cleaning out people who they thought were suspect. He ended up in the gulag, and he was a very talented engineer. So he was actually kept there longer than even his completely unfounded 10-year sentence. And his wife, later wife, the woman he met, she ended up in the gulag simply because her husband had been taken away in the middle of the night, and she had a newborn baby. She didn't know what was going on, so she left the baby with a neighbor and went to inquire after him, never to be seen again, straight to the camps herself as the wife of an enemy of the people as well. And that's where they met, and that's where my grandmother was born, in the camp. So that was the history of one side of my family.
Where was the camp? Do you know?
It was many different ones.
Right.
It was many different ones. I know that they would have all had something to do with mining, because my great grandfather was a highly skilled engineer. He designed a lot of the mining equipment and helped to build a lot of the mines that were being used in these camps. And around the country at the time, but it was in a few different places. He was moved around constantly. I think he was in Kazakhstan at certain points. So he was essentially kind of like a highly skilled member of staff, just without any pay. So he would be shipped around on different projects. And down the other side of my family, down my mother's side, my grandmother, who's still alive today, living in Ukraine, 96 years old. They were, people won't be able to see this, but I'm using quotation marks, wealthy peasants. They had a horse, and this made them kulaks, which were these supposedly wealthy, rich peasants who were to be dispossessed, so that their wealth, ill-gotten wealth, could be shared with the people. And when the communists came to their house, they kicked them out onto the street, seized all their possessions, and exiled them to Siberia. And my great uncle, who would have been my great uncle, he was a small child at the time, he starved to death on the way. And eventually my grandmother ended up making it back to Ukraine with her family, and married a guy who had been taken as a slave laborer to Germany when the Germans invaded. So, I have all of these different sides to my family from that, as you say, that part of the 20th century, who experienced a lot of things that we now don't even realize happened. And the fact that I grew up and was fortunate enough to have these people in my family to remind me of what people had gone through in living memory, I find that a really useful perspective from which to look at the modern world and to remember to be grateful every now and again.
But the Russian experience, where there's, I guess, or that brief period in the 90s, it's not really a time where you would talk about the experience of people being put into gulags as negatively. I mean, the view of the Russian people is, the Great Mother Russia. It's hugely patriotic. You don't really know. Does anyone really talk about huge pain that affected millions of people?
Yeah, I look. I think there are a lot of people who want to turn a blind eye to it. Stalin, I believe, is the most popular historical figure in Russia today, and there is a narrative going around that what he did was necessary and all of that because it makes people feel comfortable with history. There are also a lot of people who understand what happened and are very clear about the evils of communism, the evils of what was done under not only Stalin, but this is the point that I make, and the reason I wrote the book, because I'm seeing, when I talk about comparing the modern West to elements of the Soviet Union, to be clear, I'm not comparing it to the Stalinist period. I'm not saying we've got mass executions and gulags and whatever, but in the late Soviet Union, my grandfather, he made some comments about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and was made unemployable overnight, ostracized by his friends, eventually ended up leaving the country and coming to the UK, which is how he ended up here. And is that so different to what some people experience now in the environment that we operate in? The sort of, I remember during the 80s, there were these letters that would go around all the public institutions, and everybody would have to sign them saying, we absolutely support the invasion of Afghanistan, or we don't agree with this and this person because they said the wrong thing. To me, I see reflections of that in modern society when I see someone like J.K. Rowling, for example, coming out and making some very softly worded and carefully nuanced comments about the issue of transgenderism. And she's essentially ostracized, attacked, threatened, and this is with the connivance of many public figures and major institutions in this country. Yeah, I see that we live in a society where people are afraid to say what they think because the punishment will be meted out to them. So I'm concerned that we're moving in this direction because I think it's antithetical to the Western project. Everything we enjoy in the West, whether that's prosperity or comfort or safety or the advances of science or technology, these are products of societies that encourage freedom of speech and freedom of research and freedom of science over ideology and over dogma. And the fact that we've now gone back to the sort of pseudo-religious age now, where we take matters of science to be matters of faith. Trans women are women, and anyone who questions this in any way is automatically a bigot and is to be destroyed. Whatever your view of that particular issue is, even if you support that statement, you should be troubled by the fact that people are not able to have a discussion about it, and instead they're having their livelihoods and their lives destroyed over things like that. That should worry all of us.
Do you think there's an end goal? Because it doesn't feel like it's an organized movement, so is there an end goal where the masses just agree to what, which is probably ultimately quite a small, very vocal minority believe? I mean, is it a sort of a fear for everyone will ultimately be censoring themselves, and then that's sort of job done?
Well, I think we're kind of there at the moment. I'm hopeful, actually, that we're starting to see, and I hope my book is part of this movement, a bit of pushback, not from the sort of like right-wing idiots who just want to destroy the left, which I absolutely don't, but from sensible people who are saying, look, like, we need a sensible way forward. This doesn't work. We can't run around screaming #BeKind while mobbing people into suicide and sending people rape and death threats because they've got the wrong opinion. So I'm starting to see that pendulum slowing down, perhaps, if not swinging back yet. And my concern equally is that when the pendulum does swing back, I mean, if you look at history, pendulums tend to overswing in both directions. And that's a concern to me as well, that people like me who argue in favor of free speech, who argue in favor of people, being allowed to have different political views, in favor of neither being discriminatory, not tokenizing minority, nor tokenizing minorities, and just treating everybody as equals, which is what I thought when I came to the West this was all about. Right, that we don't end up in a position where actually some of those freedoms and things like, gay marriage and equal rights in other areas don't get rowed back in the wrong direction, because you're starting to see now, for example, support among young people for LGBTQ rights is actually falling. They are less supportive of that than previous generations. And I suspect that is to do with a lot of the craziness that they're seeing. So we've gone from let's treat everybody equally to, these people must be given special treatment and you mustn't say anything about this group or that group or whatever. That's off-putting to a lot of people. So my concern is that, yes, the pendulum does need to slow and stop and go back somewhat, or go in a different direction, but also we mustn't overswing either. So I don't know. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist in that I think a lot of this is, sure, it's encouraged by some people. There are people who've capitalized on it. There's people who've made careers out of going along with it. But I just think the way it's happened is some people have hijacked our empathy and weaponized empathy against us, because we live in a society, this is one of the things that makes this country great, is if you say to people in this country, well, look, my experience as an immigrant or my experience as a this or as a that is that actually there's problems in society, people will listen. In most other societies, including the ones that I come from, if you came over to Russia and started criticizing Russian society, you'd find out very quickly how badly that ends for you. But we in this country, we're much more welcoming of different opinions, and we want to hear the other side. We want to be better. And I think that's been weaponized against us a little bit, and our empathy has been hijacked. And then, of course, you have the other side, which is you have cowardly institutions and cowardly politicians who don't want to address these issues honestly, and instead they allow these activists to present themselves. This is one of the big concerns I have with both left and right, is not enough people on both sides of the political spectrum are willing to call out the extremists on both sides, on their own side. It's very easy if you're on the right to go, oh, look at these woke idiots. And equally, if you're on the left, it's very easy to go, oh, look at these right-wing evil, whatever. And that's the way the conversation happens. But actually, what I think people need to do on the left, on the moderate left, is call out the extremists and distance themselves from them. And likewise on the right. And that's when you can actually get to a position where you've got most of the country with you, and the extremists have been condemned to the fringes where they belong.
Well, looking at America, it feels like that ship has sailed. Things are so polarized there, but I do hope that that's something in this country, in Britain, that we can see more. What I like throughout your book is that you seem to be you often talk to the reader aiming, it's like you're aiming your book at readers from many different political backgrounds, which I think is quite unusual nowadays, because often, it's sort of echo chamber and people are talking to their own groups. But you're throughout the book quite keen to speak to people who are from different political beliefs.
I think it's really important.
Yeah,
it's really important.
And that's something that's quite prevalent with trigonometry as well. But it's labeled as a kind of some people label trigonometry completely wrongly, don't they? You've talked that your trigonometry's been described as right wing, but having watched a few episodes, I haven't seen much evidence of it.
Yeah, look, one of the things I really try not to do is focus on people who deliberately misinterpret what I say or what I do, because I just think that's a waste of. I could do what a lot of these activists do, which is sit here and play the victim and talk to you about all the death threats that people send me, or this happened or that happened or whatever. I'm really not that interested in it at all. We have a show in which we try to explore different perspectives, and I genuinely believe that most people in this country are sensible. Most people in this country will hear rational argument when it's presented to them. Most people in this country are not extremists. Most people in this country don't want to be associated with extremists. And they are the sensible majority, center-left, center-right, and in the center, that I want to address. And I believe they're the vast majority of this country. So why would I spend my time focusing on a few loonies? I really wanted to address everybody from left and right in the book who is open to rational argument, because I do think I have presented some very important counterfactuals to many of the things that are being advanced in the West at the moment, especially when it comes to things like the history of this country, slavery, race and racism, attitudes to immigration. These are things about which I can speak with a little bit of personal experience as well as authority. And I wanted to give people a context for how I think we can look at our society in a healthy way. And by healthy, I mean, of course, acknowledging the bad things that we've done and our country has done and our ancestors have done, without making it seem like we're the only people in the world who've ever done anything of the kind. And then I sort of tried to, we have a saying in Russian, everything is understood in context. And I try to give the context because, there's this big debate now about history and the teaching of history. Do we teach enough about slavery? And my argument is hell no. We don't teach nearly enough about slavery, not least because the only thing we teach about is the transatlantic slave trade, in which Britain and the British Empire was involved. But actually, if we taught the history of slavery around the world, then that context would give us a much better understanding of what our role is in it. And our role, in my opinion, the Western colonial powers' role, is we were involved in one of the most terrible elements of the slave trade throughout the human history. But actually, the thing that makes our experience with slavery most unique is that we ended it, and we tried to get other countries to end it. The trans-Saharan slave trade, which was happening over a longer period of time, took more black slaves out of Africa than the Western colonial powers did. The death rate was higher, and it only ended because the Western colonial powers put pressure on the Arab slave traders who were doing it to stop. So that's, to me, the context that's really, really important. Yes, bad things happened, we did them, and here's the context. That's how I think we should talk about history.
Absolutely. There's another area that I think is not explored so much, which is certainly seen in Russia and Central Europe. And we had Norman Davis on the podcast a few months ago talking about serfdom and how, that wasn't slavery, but it wasn't far off slavery.
Well, I mean, you were assigned to a piece of land for which you could not leave. You had a baron essentially who controlled that land, who could whip you for misdemeanors and misbehaving, and to whom you owed most of the food that you grew. I mean, how different is that from slavery exactly? I don't feel that it was all that different. And I also give the example, of course, we talked about already, my great-grandfather in the camps. He was kept back simply because he was useful. He was a slave. My grandfather, who was taken as a slave labor to Germany, this was within living memory, Ollie. This was there are people alive today who went through that. So I just think that we do ourselves a disservice when we rip our history out of the broader historical picture. We've got to understand ourselves in a context, because I think one of the strongest elements of Britain is our willingness to look at ourselves and to be self-critical and to want to grow and improve. But that is impossible if you've decided that you're irredeemably bad and hopeless and the most evil people in the world. That not much growth comes out of that. It's the same with you as a person. If you think about your flaws and the things that you're not perfect at and you'd like to get better at, you can improve. But if you decide that you're hopeless and irredeemable and worthless and the worst person that's ever lived, you're going to struggle to move forward and to have a healthy view of yourself and to live a life that is fulfilling and meaningful. So I think that as a society, we've got to do the same. We've got to reckon with our past, but we've also got to embrace the fact that we are one of the most open, welcoming, tolerant societies, not just in the world today, but the entire history of the human species. And we've got to be cognizant of that, as well as the mistakes we've made, if we're going to succeed in the 21st century, in which, and this is really the main point that I wanted to make in the book, it is very important that in the West we have a healthy conception of ourselves, because if we don't, we undermine ourselves. If you think you're the worst society ever, why would you defend yourself against threats? And as I think we've seen in recent months, we have threats. I've been trying to make this point to people for years. Nobody wanted to listen. Nobody cared. Now we know we have threats. Now we know that there are people who want to challenge the world order that we've lived in for a very long time, that has delivered the safety and prosperity and stability that we enjoy. There are people coming. And if we're not ready, if we're not confident in ourselves, if we're not willing to stand up for what we believe in, then those people will come and they will take over.
Now, you've alluded to Putin's invasion of Ukraine there. Do you think that the West now has reached a turning point? We've seen increasingly more unity from the West, particularly after the fracturing of the last few years.
I hope so. And I have to say I've been pleasantly surprised by the unity that most Western countries have shown. I think there are notable outliers on that, Germany in particular. But broadly speaking, I've been very pleasantly surprised. And I hope that is a moment when people wake up and realize that it's a tale as old as time. If you become, if you spend your entire life navel gazing and obsessing about what's wrong with you. There are other people who outside of the gates who are not obsessing about what's wrong with them. They are quite interested in those very old-fashioned things like land, power, oil, money, military conquest, etc. And I hope this has given people the wake-up call that they've needed to realize we can't afford to navel gaze for the rest of eternity. There are people who are quite happy. The Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, made it very clear repeatedly. He said the purpose of what we're doing in Ukraine is to remove the West's influence from Eastern Europe. They want to expand, and they want us to withdraw. So what's happening in Ukraine is not some localized conflict. It is a deliberate attempt to challenge the power of Western countries, the United States, Britain, and others, and to force us back. And one of the reasons they're doing it is they see us divided. And of course, Russia and China very busily helping us divide ourselves by spamming our social media with fake accounts that amplify all these pointless cultural divisions, so that we cannot concentrate and think about the things that actually matter. Like you mentioned, our values are under threat. I wonder how many people in Britain in public would be happy to define what Western or British values are. If you ask a person in the street what are British values, I think you'd get a lot of mumbling and ahhing, because it's sort of not cool anymore to think that Britain has values that we all believe in. Values have been, the sort of Britain's values have been replaced with all of this sort of like tolerance and diversity, which is fine in and of itself. But I don't think that is what Vladimir Putin is challenging. Do you know what I mean? It's not tolerance and diversity that he's against particularly. What I think he is against is freedom, democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, the ability for people to make their own decisions, national self-determination, respect for democratic norms, freedom of speech in journalism, freedom of research, all of these things, right? But people don't want to articulate that because somehow that's become associated with the wrong politics or whatever. So we need a wake-up call. I hope this is the one that we needed. I suspect we've got more coming.
There's probably also, if you asked a Brit in the street, there's also that self-deprecating, I wouldn't want to blow my own trumpet about that kind of thing, inevitably. I wanted to talk a little bit about, because we're nearly at the end, there's some fantastic little snippets throughout the book that you've written about, but in particular, you've got your 10 ways to destroy the West. Do you have a kind of any sort of ambitions yourself beyond trigonometry?
My sense is you're asking about politics.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, no, God, no. I've always said to comedians, some friends of mine sometimes ask me about.
But you come up with answers. You see, that's what I mean. Whereas often you get polemicists and critics will talk about the problems but not the answers.
Sure. Well, and I hope that there are people in positions of influence who read the book and see if those solutions that I've proposed are suitable for them, that they can sell those to the public, they can deliver those. Everybody has a role to play. And my role, I think, is to facilitate conversation, to express opinions, to shape some of the dialogue on these issues, I hope, to contribute to the discussion, to give it a different perspective. But I never wanted to be a politician. I am far too uninterested in other people's opinions of me to be a politician. Like, I'm quite happy to express an opinion that most people will dislike, whereas a politician, I think, certainly in the modern era, doesn't have that luxury. And that's not something I'm willing to let go. So I've got my role to play. And, I see now, for example, with the Tory leadership contest, there are a lot of people who are now being forced to address some of the cultural issues that I bring up, whether that's the issue of race and slavery. Kemi Badenoch, for example, is somebody who's quite big on pushing back against some of the modern narratives on that issue. It's, the conversation around trans, again, that's something a lot of the leadership candidates are now being forced to address. So I feel that in doing the show and writing the book and offering my commentary on the subject, I'm one of a large number of people who are contributing to making sure that these issues get addressed. And that is how I see my role. I think any comedian, particularly a comedian like me, who wanted to push boundaries and make edgy jokes and continues to do that, would be absolutely insane to go into politics, because they will just, like we were talking right at the beginning of the conversation, people won't give you the benefit of the doubt. They won't say, well, look, this was said to a boozy crowd on a Saturday night in a comedy club with irony. They will just take the clip and say, you meant this. Literally, and this is the equivalent of you saying it at 9 a.m. in the morning on Good Morning Britain.
Right. Well, we've seen a comedian in Ukraine do well.
We have. He's not actually a comedian, though. This is
no, I know. I'm being a bit. Yeah.
He's a sketch. He's the head of a sketch group and really a media executive as well. So he had some managerial experience before he went into politics too. Actually, I'm not keen to follow in his footsteps for any number of reasons. He's got quite a tough job on his hands, unfortunately.
He certainly has. So we're coming to him. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm going to put links to everything we've described, we've talked about in the show notes. In particular, the book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. There are also a couple of talks that are on trigonometry that are really good for our listeners, which is the one with Tom Holland, which was excellent. And then also Roger Morehouse, Tom Holland talking about sort of the almost puritanical echoes from history of where we are now. And then Roger Morehouse is excellent on the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the Russian misunderstanding of history. Well, the Putin's misunderstanding of history.
Historians are some of our favorite guests, to be honest, because I really feel that history has such a powerful explanatory power for many things that are happening in society in the present time. We love talking to historians about all sorts of different things, because it's just, I think one of my biggest disappointments, I say I had a good education at school, and I suppose I did, but history is taught so poorly, and not just in this country, but actually in every country. I think we get so little, and it's so decontextualized. And I've made it my life's business, if you like, to try and catch up and try and fill some of those gaps. So anytime we manage to have a historian on to talk about some aspect of history that I didn't know about, it's just a gift. So yeah, those two are in particular are really, really good episodes. I recommend people check out.
Great. Well, Konstantin, thanks so much for your time. I'll let you get back to the warm weather.
Ollie, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So as I said at the start, you can get links in the show notes. Thanks so much to those who've got in touch and are enjoying the pod. A particular shout out to a Peruvian listener. And who'd have thought I'd have such a reach? Hello to Pablo Andres Moscoso de la Cuba. So glad you enjoy aspects of history. Coming up in the next few weeks and months, we've got Miranda Malins on Oliver Cromwell, Timothy Ashby on Elizabethan spies and their black ops, and Ben McIntyre on Colditz. I'll be taking a bit of a break in August, but we'll resume in the autumn with more great names and great history. Thank you, and good night.